Under the light blue sky there is a border town, Bologna. The territory is connected with several labyrinths. Among them there is one called the Poisonous Labyrinth. The air in it discourages any desire of adventurers to explore it. The main character enters the labyrinth and sees a cave shrouded in smoke. Other adventurers hate him, but he is a frequent guest here. Because of this he was nicknamed the Unclean Picker. Rude goes deep into the cave and loudly says that this is great. He looks ahead at the bright green plants that are on the 6th floor of the dungeon and thinks that today was also a good harvest. The impure grass has purification effects. For him it is the main source of income. He collects the grass in a bag and thinks that he will not take much, only the necessary minimum. It will be enough for him for 3 days. Rude heard a squeaking sound and looks around. He saw 3 great poisonous rats in front of him. Most of the local monsters use poison, adding to the list of reasons why adventurers avoid this place. One of the rats releases blue poison from its mouth. Rude takes out his sword and thinks that it won't work against him. He breaks through the blue poison and cuts one of the rats with his sword. The other rats see this and fly towards him with the intention of attacking. Rude cuts the rat. At the same time the second rat jumps on his hand and bites his armor. He hears someone loudly about to use a fireball and turns around at the sound. The fireball hits the rat, and Rude flies to the floor watching it. He turns around with a drop of sweat on his face, and hears an unknown person loudly say that he missed by a little. He sees 3 guys in front of him. One of them tells the other that he should have come closer first. Rude thinks that he has seen these faces many times in the Adventurers Guild. One of the guys bends down asking for forgiveness and asks he is Rude, right? He thought he was in trouble, so he hurried to help. Rude gets up from the ground and thanks the guy for his work. In the future, he asks to warn him about this in advance. The guy looks at him in bewilderment and asks, didn't he shout fireball? One of the 3 guys looks around the corner and says that there is a whole grove of unclean grass. The other guy thinks that they are very lucky. Rude, with a drop of sweat on his face, asks if they really followed him on purpose to find his slutty place. One of the guys looks at him in bewilderment and loudly says that they are just adventurers scouting the area. They accidentally ran into him and even saved his skin. Can't the Unclean Picker even thank him properly? They look at him, showing with their whole appearance that a fight is about to happen. Rude reluctantly closes his eyes, apologizing for bothering him and for helping him out. Sometime later, under the night sky in Bologna, there is a restaurant where Rude lives. He falls to the floor in pain, holding his hand. 2 unknown men loudly say that his presence alone makes the food sour. He needs to be told everything. He won't think of it with his stupid head. One of the men approaches him and creates a fireball in his hand, saying that adventurers are actually people with the ability to fight monsters. And someone like him, with a useless debuff cancellation, does not dare to call himself an adventurer. Rude, with a drop of sweat on his face, looks down. Debuff cancellation, such is his ability. It helps him calmly explore all kinds of poisonous labyrinths, but does not give any advantage over monsters, which is the basic point for an adventurer. If he does not have combat skills, no one will take him on the team. He is called a filthy picker because he can only pick up someone's things in low-rank poison labyrinths. In short, a bad skill. Rude walks out of the restaurant with a downcast look, scratches his chin and thinks that he is a scum among adventurers. He is already a grown man, but even a fight with a rat is a fight to the death for him. Rude lies on the bed and wonders if the life of an filthy picker is really his limit. Sometime later, in the Adventurers Guild, Rude opens the door and with a dissatisfied look thinks that he needs to find another grove before the money runs out. He looks around and wonders what is going on here. It is a bit too noisy today, isn't it? Rude asks, were there any good errands given today? The guild worker looks ahead and wonders if this is a picker. A new labyrinth has recently been opened. Rude looks at her in surprise and thinks that this means that the new labyrinth is full of treasures and magic items. A gold mine for an adventurer. He looks around and thinks that it's no wonder why it's so noisy today. The girl looks at him and says that the unclean grass he supplied them with has become cheaper. Rude asks in surprise why this happened. The girl closes her eyes and waves her hand and says that the grass is only needed by those who go to the poisonous labyrinth. And from this day on, people will go to the new one, so the demand for grass will fall. Rudd, with beads of sweat on his face and bewilderment, lowers his eyes down. She, with a calm face, says that the new labyrinth is called the Avilio Mountains, but he is not allowed to go there. Rude leans his hands on the table and asks why he cannot go there. The girl holds out a sheet of paper to his face and says that they have requirements, only D rank and above. And he is E rank, not qualified enough. Rudd, with a bead of sweat on his face, looks at her and loudly says that he also wants to go to the new labyrinth. He asks if there is no way for him to get in there. The girl exhales and says that rules are rules. If you stick your nose in, you will only die in vain. Rudd, with a puzzled face, turns around and sees an unknown person. A guy named Bayer asks if he wants to go there so badly. How about joining his team as a porter? After some time, a cart with warriors moves through the forest. Rude, with a calm face, sits inside the cart with his new team. Bayer looked at him and with a smile said loudly that it was so good that they met. He really needed a person to collect materials from the new labyrinth, but he could not find anyone. Rude looked at him and thought that maybe it was because all the adventurers from the guild were already in the labyrinth. This could well complicate the search for a porter. A girl from the team named Sasha asks why an unclean picker out of all the possible options. The second one from the team named Rick with a dissatisfied face asked if he could not find someone better. Bayer, with a drop of sweat on his face and a smile, looks at them and tells them not to think so. He has been working as an adventurer for quite a long time. He will certainly be better than newbies. He puts his hand on his chest and looks at Rude and introduces his allies once again. Rude introduces himself with a serious face and says that he is an E rank and would be happy to work with them. Bayer, with a satisfied face, says that before they enter, he would like to know a little more about him. He asks if Rude minds if he takes a look at his guild card. Rude reaches into his bag and approvingly replies that he does not mind. He takes out a card from which a hologram appears with a system window showing his skills. Bayer asks in surprise, can he also cast spells? Rude looks at him and says that these forces are not enough for a fight, but sometimes they help out in dark alleys, in cooking and the like. Bayer, with a smile on his face, says that it is quite useful and he is counting on it. The carriage continues to move under a bright blue sky. The team happily looks ahead. Bayer loudly said that they have finally arrived. This is a new Avilio labyrinth. Sasha holds her staff in her hand and with a smile on her face loudly says that it looks like they got there first. Rick looks ahead and says that he wants to explore it quickly. The gates of the labyrinth open and they see a crowd of people. Sasha holds her head in her hands and says loudly with displeasure that there are adventurers everywhere. What bad luck. Bayer scratches the back of his head in bewilderment and says that the initial floors have already been fully explored. Rick with a satisfied face says that then they just have to go deeper. There are probably far fewer people there. Sasha looks at him with a smile on her face says that he is right. Rude said with a serious face that this labyrinth was still poorly explored and it would be better to start with the map of the first floor. Before he could finish speaking, Sasha and Rick interrupted him and asked why the porter decided to speak out. That's why he was stuck at rank E. Bayer loudly and discontentedly tells them to stop. Rude didn't say anything bad. He may not be happy about it, but he agrees with the guys. At this rate, they won't see any prey, so it's time for them to go down. They go towards the stairs leading down and go down to the 4th floor of the Avilio labyrinth. Rude looks ahead with fear in his eyes and sees a monster about to attack him. Rick, with a satisfied face, manages to come to the rescue and strikes the monster. He turns around and asks why he twitches from every small monster. Sasha, with an evil grin on her face, delivers an electric shock to the monster with her staff. Bayer takes advantage of the moment and chops off the monster's head. Rude watches what is happening and thinks that they are very strong, and he is not even able to move. Bayer finishes off the remaining monsters with his sword and Sasha says that it is good that they decided to come down here. Fewer people, more oxygen. Bayer looks at the glowing ring on his finger and says that the monsters here are not that strong, and they finally found treasure. Rick looks at Rude and loudly tells him to collect things from the monsters he killed. Rude wipes his forehead and says that he can't, their skins are too damaged. He thinks there isn't even a magic stone left. Rick looks at him with an angry expression and asks, what if that's not true? Is the picker slacking off? Rude clenches his fist in displeasure and says that he will do it now. He looks at the dead monster and thinks that all his guts are outside and it stinks terribly. Why did he have to go so far? Rude looks at his finger from which the fire blew and wonders if he should set it on fire a little. Rick looks at him and mockingly asks that he decided to burn his monster. Is he really going to eat it? Although they have indeed been wandering for a long time, he is hungry. In such a situation, it is not surprising to stare at the monster's meat. Sasha looks at him and tells him to stop. This is very disgusting. She asks with a serious face that besides, this is a taboo, isn't it? If they absorb their mana, who knows what will happen to them? Rick replies with a smile on his face that he was just joking. When they return, he will eat his fill with the money he earned like it was his last time. The team panics and looks ahead questioningly. They cannot believe that a minotaur is standing in front of them. Rude clenches his teeth and thinks that this is a B-rank monster. What is a B-rank monster doing on such a simple floor? Rick and Sasha look ahead and say that there is no way they can defeat this. What should they do? Bayer turns around in horror and says loudly that Rude should give him his backpack. He wants to use the item from it. Bayer grabs his backpack and tells him to keep an eye on the minotaur. Rude agrees and asks if he has a plan. He swings his sword with an angry face and says that he has a plan. Bayer strikes Rude, leaving a large bleeding wound on his back. He calls out to the team as Rude falls to the ground in pain. Rick, with a satisfied grin, throws his axe next to Rude, using the combat stimulus skill, which draws the monster's attention to the target. Sasha, with a drop of sweat on her face and a smile, uses the acceleration skill, which doubles her movement speed. Rude lies on the ground and asks, did they really want to abandon him from the beginning? Bayer, with blood on his face and an evil smile, thinks that who in their right mind would agree to team up with an unclean picker? He and his team run in the other direction and loudly say goodbye to Rude. He closed his eyes and, bleeding, loudly says that he is very unhappy. He gets up from the ground and watches as the minotaur swings its axe at him. The monster strikes, but he manages to dodge. Rude, with beads of sweat on his face, looks ahead and thinks that he is about to be killed. The minotaur strikes Rude in the chest with his hand, causing him to fly into the wall. The stone surrounding him begins to crack and they fall down. Bloody Rude fell and wondered how he could have survived. Apparently, the minotaur's carcass softened his fall, but his death is only a matter of time. Even if he is lucky enough not to meet other monsters here, he will still die from blood loss or hunger before he can recover. He thinks about how hungry he is. Is there anything to eat? What is he thinking about? Rude doesn't know what will happen next. What if he tries to eat a monster? What a miserable life he has lived. Rude is surprised to see a white light in front of him and memories come over him. An unknown person holds his hand on his shoulder and tells him that no matter how hard it is, he should never give up. Rude comes back from his memories and bites off a piece of flesh from a minotaur with an evil look. If a person with depleted mana tries the meat of a monster that is full of it, the monster's mana particles will leak into his body and monsterization will begin. This is a terrible fate, even worse than drinking poison in one gulp, so it is taboo. In order to replenish the blood loss and satisfy his hunger, Rude took a risk that led to an unexpected transformation. He staggered into the cave and saw a multitude of bats flying towards him with the intention of attacking. Enraged, Rude looked at them and used the roar skill, which stunned and intimidated the enemy. Half of the bats fell to the ground while the other half flew towards him. Rude used the strength gain skill, which temporarily increased the target's strength. He swung his axe and struck the monsters. Rude took a bat wing and bit off a piece of it. With a crazy smile on his face, he used the echolocation skill, which detects living creatures around and is effective even in the dark. Rude heard something and turned his head towards the sound. He thought that a whole bunch of monsters had come running and asked who was here who couldn't wait to become a snack. With bright yellow eyes, he furiously chopped off the arm and head of one of the monsters. Rude cuts down a tentacle monster and thinks that the axe fits perfectly in his hand, and he also feels the mana of the monsters without even looking at them. He swings the axe and cuts down another monster, eating its eye. Rude is bent over and with a bloody face thinks that every time he devours a monster, his body is filled with strength. With a furious smile and bright red eyes, he strikes the 4 monsters standing in front of him with an axe. After some time, a bloody Rude opens the gate of the labyrinth and looks ahead in bewilderment. He drops the axe and with beads of sweat on his face says loudly that he was able to get out and stay alive. Some time later, in the Adventurers Guild, a crowd of unknown people are looking at a white-haired elderly man in the center. He says with a serious face that he listened to their report and recalled all the adventurers who were there from the labyrinth. Lankers, the guild master of the Ballon branch, looks at Bayer and says that he has recalled everyone except Rudd, who was with them. Bayer looked down, clenched his teeth and said that the moment they encountered the Minotaur on the 4th floor and died, they didn't have a chance to help him. If only they could have noticed this freak earlier. Lockhars with a serious face says that he understood the situation. The guild worker leans on her hand with a sad look and says that they will impose a ban on entering the labyrinth. She gets up from her chair with a drop of sweat on her face and looks forward in surprise. The girl sees Rude opening the door and wonders, is this unclean picker, didn't he die? Lockhars and the team look at him in surprise. Bayer runs up to Rude, grabs his hands and loudly says that he is fine. He whispers in his ear that if he says anything, he will kill him. Rick with a smile on his face approaches Rude and asks if he is hurt. Sasha with a calm face says that they wanted to go back for him, but the labyrinth was immediately sealed. Rude stands still and watches as Bayer happily says that in any case, they need to celebrate his return. But perhaps it should be done elsewhere. The team with beads of sweat on their faces think that they cannot move. Rude with a serious face looks forward and loudly says that they used him as bait. Bayer stretches his hands forward and with a bead of sweat on his face asks what he is saying. Lockhars looks at him and asks what do you mean used as bait? Rude with a serious face says that Bayer took his backpack and hit him in the back, and Rick used a skill to focus the monster's attention on him. Then Sasha cast a speed boost on them so that the whole group could escape. Bayer stretches his hands out to Lockhars and loudly says that they did nothing of the sort. He turns his head to the unknown man with a staff walking towards them and says that they need to establish the truth. An unknown white-haired girl with a purple hood and staff watches this. The company with fear on their faces looks forward and asks, is this a truth seeker? But what is a truth seeker doing here? They almost never leave the capital. Lockhars with a serious face says that the thing is that the porters they hired began to die too often. He took advantage of an old commitment to call one of the truth seekers here. Lockhars asks the truth seeker, Bayer's or Rude's testimony, which of them is true? She with bright blue eyes says that the members of the Scarlet Sword lied. The truth seeker raises the staff emitting light and says that Rude told the truth. The people in the guild look at each other in bewilderment. Bayer points his finger at her with a furious face and asks loudly, what could this upstart know? Lankers with a serious face says that she has the skill of truth. It is almost impossible to develop the skill, but its effectiveness is put on par with unique skills. Someone who has the skill of truth cannot be deceived. His words are more reliable than any oaths. This power serves the country faithfully and truly. But abandoning his comrades is a taboo for an adventurer. Not only do they intentionally injure them to divert the monster's attention to them. If their deeds are subjected to proper investigation, their qualifications will definitely be revoked and they will become slaves. Sasha holds her head in her hands and closes her eyes loudly says that this cannot be. Rick with a frightened face asks that they must be joking. Bayer clenched his fist and thought that he cannot imagine that he would become a slave. He looks at the truth seeker and thinks that if only she were not here, everything would be fine. Bayer, with a face full of rage, swings his sword and shouts loudly. Rude makes a quick dash forward and deflects his blow with his sword. He loudly tells Bayer with a serious face not to dare touch the truth seeker. Rude very quickly strikes him in the face, which knocks out his tooth. Bayer flies into the wall with a crash and people from the street turn their attention to this. Rude with a serious face says that this cannot be done. Sometime later, in the guest room of the Adventurers Guild, Lockhars is sitting on the couch opposite Rude. He apologizes for disturbing him and says that he must be tired. Rude with a thoughtful face says that nothing and what is much more important is what will happen to them. All three were arrested by the guild staff. Their case will be thoroughly investigated. Lockhars says with anger on his face that if their repeated crimes are confirmed and it turns out that they framed their porters, then the members of the Scarlet Sword will lose all their assets and status as adventurers and become slaves. But Bayer has gone too far. He has swung at the Seeker of Truth and most likely, he will never see him again. One way or another, they lose the right to their prey in the new labyrinth. In that case, he should take it. Rude looks in surprise at the large gold bag lying on the table. Lockhars says that there are about 200,000 regines and asks to take them. After some time, Rude stands near the exit and holds the bag in his hands. He squeezes it with his hands and with joy on his face thinks that finally he will have enough to live on. One can save up such a sum for a lifetime by collecting unclean herbs alone, and adventurers can make money. Rude stands surrounded by people and thinks that no one even teases after what they saw. However, they did not treat him any better either. If they continue to arise, his sudden return may also raise questions and it would be best to return to the poisonous labyrinth. Rude looks forward with determination and thinks that he has enough of thinking about bad things. After all, he has earned money, finally, and he should take care of equipment and eat heartily. After some time, he looks at a store with unknown things and thinks that he will first look into the equipment shop. Rude looks at something with surprise on his face and asks, is this a magic bag? He thinks that he would better eat after all. The next day in the underground labyrinth, the huge rat was struck by a sword blow. Rude stands with an imperturbable face near several dead rats and says that who would have known that he could kill them so easily. Just a day ago, 5 of them chased him like a cockroach. Rude closes one eye and uses the appraisal skill. His eye lights up yellow. He begins to scan the rat and sees all its characteristics. He got this skill by eating that monster. You can even evaluate corpses with it. Rude walks forward and thinks, so they were level 9? Does that mean his own status has increased a lot? If the rats were that light, he must be level 20. Rude looks at the guild card that is emitting light and tells it to open. He looks at his stats and asks with admiration, isn't this level 42? He was level 7 just yesterday. What a gift, I should probably check his skills too. He presses his finger on the system window where his skills are written and says loudly that he needs to show them. Rude sees a lot of skills in his system window and asks, how can there be so many? This is amazing. When he passed the place where he fell in the new labyrinth, The wall that should have been broken was intact. The new labyrinth will remain closed for some time. So for today, he planned to only walk through the poisonous labyrinth. Rude clenches his hand into a fist and thinks that he wants to test his new powers. He wants to see how effective they are on the deeper floors and also to test his purchase. The main thing is to choose the right monster for the first time. On the 6th floor, Rude cuts down all the rats with his sword. On the 9th floor, he destroys frogs. On the 13th floor, he kills a huge monster that resembles a spider and thinks that these are no good. He needs to go even deeper for worthy prey. After some time, on the 24th floor, in the darkness, there is a monster that looks like a lizard with a sword in his hand. Rude looks at the monster standing with his back to him, sitting behind a tree. He uses his appraisal skill and sees that it is a warrior lizard. They usually fight in groups, but this one walks alone. Rude looks at his sword with a smile on his face and thinks that it is worth trying to kill it. He stands behind the lizard and swings his sword at it. Rude hits its hand with his weapon, but it manages to move and does not receive serious damage. He says with a smirk on his face that the lizard is not bad, only he will not miss next time. Rude watches as the lizard begins to move away into the depths of the cave and with a puzzled look on his face asks where he is running to. He says loudly that the lizard needs to stop. Rude looks ahead in surprise at the lizard, who stopped near the wall and thinks that this is a dead end. He stands behind the lizard and says that now he will not escape. The lizard turns his head towards Rude and looks at him with disdain. He tries to get his sword and thinks that this is a curse. Rude turns his head and with beads of sweat on his face looks at the two huge lizards that are standing in front of him and thinks that this is a trap. He thinks with anger on his face that he was tricked like an idiot. Even with such a difference in levels, the situation is bad. The lizard hits Rude with his weapon, but he manages to dodge the blow and thinks that in this case, he will kill them one by one. Rude with anger on his face hits the lizard with his sword and loudly says that he should get it. The lizard hit the wall with his head and closed his eyes after a strong blow. He opened his eyes and sees Rude with a purple aura in his eyes swinging his sword at him and loudly saying that he is finished. He hit the lizard with his weapon, but the lizard managed to cover himself with a shield. Rude with a drop of sweat on his face thinks, what is this? He turns his gaze and sees a lizard man slashing at him with his weapon, but he manages to jump to the side. Rude holds his sword on his shoulder with a happy face and says that it was close. The lizard men surround him from all sides and he wonders why there are so many of them. However, even if these monsters work well together, using tactics such as luring along with attack coordination is overkill. He thinks that right before they started cooperating, he heard a high-pitched sound. Rude turns his head and sees many lizard men running towards him, and in the center there is a red monster standing with its arms crossed. He uses his appraisal skill on it and finds out its characteristics. Rude thinks that he understands everything with a smirk on his face and asks, is he the boss here? The lizardman's eyes began to glow bright green and it made a loud sound. All the lizard men obeyed him and opened their mouths. They jumped forward and pointed their weapons towards Rude. He filled his body with red mana and used the skill Surge of Power. Rude, with determination on his face and a drop of sweat running down, shouts loudly. He cuts all the lizards that were standing next to him with his sword. One of the lizards looks at him and makes a piercing sound. Rude steps on its head with his foot and flies over the heads of the lizards with the sword in his hands. He looks at the lizard and thinks that he caught it. Rude hits it with all his strength with his sword and asks, what is this? He wonders how the lizard was not even scratched. The lizard opened its mouth and pointed the weapon towards Rude. He thinks with horror on his face that he cannot escape. The lizard's weapon hits Rude's chest, but does not penetrate it. He uses his skill Impenetrable with confidence on his face and says that he is not the only one with techniques. The lizard looks at Rude and asks something in his language. Rude looks ahead with his yellow eye and wonders, what is going on? He feels like he's dealing damage, but he's not even scratched. He doesn't even have a skill that can increase his resistance. Maybe someone else is involved, but he doesn't see anything similar among their skills. Rude looks ahead with his yellow eye and thinks, that's it. A lizard is standing in front of him with severe wounds on his stomach. Rude thinks that this lizard has a substitution skill and took someone else's damage on himself. The lizard looks ahead in horror. Rude plunges his sword into his stomach and thinks that it's hard to be the one who gets the bad deeds of others. He barely stands on his feet surrounded by lizards and holds a sword in his hand. One of the lizards screams loudly in his language and monsters with weapons in their hands jump towards Rude. He uses his fetter control skill. Rude flies up above the lizards' heads on a thread of mana. The main lizard looks ahead in horror. Rude starts hitting them with his mana threads and loudly says that they are so crowded together that it will be even easier for him. He hits the lizards with his threads and loudly says that they should get it. Rude hits all the monsters around with his mana. The lizard looks at him in horror. The threads of his mana have confused all the lizards. One of them, wrapped in a thread, says something in his own language. He looks at him with determination on his face and says that it looks like victory is his. Rude, with a grin on his face, cuts the lizard's head in half and it flies to the side. He stands in the center of the slain lizards and says that now, bon appetit to him. Rude holds a bag in his hands and says that he bought it with the money he received from the guild. It's time to see it in action. The magic bag is brown with silver fastenings and its capacity is artificially increased by magic. The weight of the bag does not change. Rude holds a bag in his hands and puts his hand in it. He takes out something from it and thinks it is cooking utensils and spices. Back then on the lower floors he was in despair, but he really wanted to try this. Rude cuts the meat and starts to fry it and wonders if monster meat can be tasty. He looks at the cooked monster meat on the plate and wonders what if it is cooked correctly. Rude, with drooling mouth from the pleasant smell of food, bites into a piece of meat. He says with a blush and a smile on his face that it is very tasty. At this rate, he will become addicted to it. He takes out his guild card and sees a hologram with a system window with his new skills written on it and loudly says that he has gained skills. Rude eats the meat and wonders why it is so tasty. Is it because of the mana that is full of monster meat? The skills of the Minotaur, Armored Spider, and the Evil Eye were quite useful. Of the monsters whose skills he had not yet used, the only ones left were the Thunderwolf and the Black Snake. Rude clenches his fists and says loudly that he'll have a monster platter on the way back. Speaking of skills, where's the lizard with the substitute? Rude looks at the dead lizard. After some time, a torch is burning in the poisonous labyrinth of the 21st floor. There are flying monsters and frogs breathing green gas. Rude holds his hand with yellow lightning coming out near his face and looks forward with his bright blue eyes. Rude directs strong yellow lightning from his hand towards the monsters and says loudly that this is the skill lightning cover. The defeated monsters fall down to the ground. He looks at his hand and with a grin on his face thinks that this is also a very useful skill. It seems that they were monsters specializing in status debuffs, but they picked on the wrong guy. Rude holds a frying pan in his hand with a smile on his face and loudly says that he is now having frog legs and a butterfly wing crust for dinner. He cooked beautiful and rosy frog legs in a breading and thinks that they are just like chicken legs. Rude eats the paws with a smile on his face and thinks that they are very tender, and with the spices they even remind me of chicken. I wish he had something to drink. He gains new skills. Rude hears strange sounds and looks forward with a surprised expression. He turns his head back and wonders what was that. The sounds of a crash and a human voice? Rude holds a frog leg in his hand with a smile on his face and wonders if there are other adventurers who have come this far. He puts the frying pan in his bag and thanks it for the food. Rude runs towards the sounds and thinks that this is a rare chance to see others in battle. If he is lucky, he will learn something new. At the same time, blood is dripping from the blade. Unknown men are standing in front of a bleeding man. An unknown man with a green robe is lying on the ground, and a bloody sword blade is pointed at him. A guy with blonde hair and an open mouth with his tongue hanging out loudly says that he cannot believe that there is so much mana left in her. A man with black hair and a terrifying grin on his face says that it was worth the sweat. He brought his hand to the girl's hood. Under the hood was an elf girl with silver hair. She looks forward with beads of sweat dripping down her face. 3 men ask how much they can give for such a thing. Rude ran to the place where the sounds were and said that he hoped to make friends among the adventurers. Everyone turned towards him. Rude steps forward with determination and says that he doesn't know what's going on here. But he won't pass by the girl who is being attacked by a crowd. A man with black hair and a scar on his eye asks who he is. Rude, with a smirk on his face, says loudly that he is an adventurer and thinks, even if it is only E rank. An elf with a drop of sweat on her face says loudly that he needs to leave. They are bounty hunters. He uses his skill and his eye turns yellow. Rude thinks that he has heard of them. They are all quite high rank. He uses his skill on Falses and wonders why he has not shown his stats. He uses his skill on 3 more guys, but he does not see their stats either. Rude looks at them and wonders if they have something like concealment, or even a magic blocker. Falses with a languid look looks forward and says that they need to kill him. A guy with blonde hair and a sword in his hand jumps towards Rude. He looks ahead with horror on his face and thinks he's fast. The guy looks ahead with a grin on his face and loudly says he's not bad. Rude looks at him with a smile on his face and says he's just weak. The guy with a furious face says loudly that he is not weak and he will kill him now. The guys watch their fight. Rude blows on the sword and uses his poison skill. He starts spraying poison from his mouth into the guy's face. He holds his face in horror with his hands, which began to dissolve and loudly makes different sounds from pain. The guys look at Zarius lying on the ground and ask, is he spitting poison? They look at Rude, who is holding a sword in his hands and think that he is like a monster. He looks forward with a grin on his face and a drop of sweat dripping down and thinks that this is a rather reckless fighting style, completely unsuitable for an adventurer. But he helped him, such a weak one, survive. Falses looks forward and thinks that poison is his unique skill. It seems that he should not be underestimated. He says with a terrifying face that we need to attack at once, all 3 of us. 2 guys with swords in their hands jump towards Rude. One of the blows almost hit his head, but he managed to dodge. Rude thinks that if he stops for even a second, he will be killed. The guy with long hair and a menacing face hit Rude with a sword, but he managed to block the blow. He is on one knee on the ground. Falses threw his leg over Rude's head. He uses his skill impenetrability with a grin on his face and beads of sweat running down. Falses kicks him and he falls into a green viscous liquid. He looks forward and thinks that he is a strong guy. He was sure that he would break his spine. Rude tries to get up from the green swamp. The guy with long hair and a grin on his face says loudly that it is time for him to prepare for death. Rude runs back through the swamp. He loudly asks where he ran to. Falses looks at him and says that he needs to stop. This is a poisonous swamp and if he goes deeper, he may not get back out. Rude will also have a hard time in the poison. He will soon crawl out on his own. He continues to walk forward in the swamp with poison. They wonder how long he plans to hang around in the poison swamp. The guys loudly say that they just need to finish the job, as adventurers should. Luckily, there was a poison swamp nearby. In addition to the poison itself, the poisonous fumes from the swamp also significantly reduced the agility of adventurers. The guy with long hair asks, did that freak in there put down roots or something? The second guy with black hair and beads of sweat running down his face loudly says that he has been there for 10 minutes. Even he already has a headache. Rude thinks that it is time. He would like to weaken them a little more, but if he hesitates, the elf's wounds will only get worse. He comes out of the swamp and asks what they want. Double damage from the fumes and poison of the swamp. The guys look at him and ask, has he finally given up? The guy with long hair says that he caused them trouble. Rude with a straight face says that he doesn't care. He is not affected by debuffs. He has no idea how they feel. Falses with an angry face thinks, is he resistant to debuffs? He tricked them. Falses with an angry face points forward and loudly says that they need to kill him immediately. Rude stands in the swamp and looks forward. He holds a sword in his hand with a smirk on his face and attacks one of the guys. Rude with a happy face asks, did the poison of the swamp drain his stamina? And the accumulated poison in your lungs lowered your stats. He turns his head to the side and sees a guy with long hair running towards him with a sword in his hand. Rude uses his impenetrable skill and the guy's attack does not hit him. The guy with long hair looks at him with a surprised face. Rude uses his impenetrable skill and yellow lightning engulfs him. He slams his sword onto the ground and loudly says that this is the lightning coating skill. The boys are covered in lightning and electrocuted all over their bodies. They fall to the ground after receiving a powerful lightning strike. The guy with long hair is covered in smoke after the strike and loudly says that Rude is ugly. He holds up his hand, from which a green light comes out, and uses the air/skill. Rude points his hand towards the boys and hits them with a green beam. Falsus looks at this with horror on his face and thinks that poison, impenetrability, lightning coat, and even air/all are his. How does a person get so many monster abilities? Rude with determination on his face heads towards him and says that he does not need to know. He slams his sword onto him. Falsus thinks that although he has an absolute advantage in fights with people, but because of this poison, it seems that he will lose. He uses his skill, Dexterity Enchantment. His eye starts glowing a bright pink, and he says that he can't lose to such a freak. Falsus points his sword at him with great rage on his face. Rude uses a surge of power and breaks his sword into many pieces. Falsus looks at his broken weapon in disappointment. He takes a strong blow to the stomach with the sword and falls to the ground. Rude holds the bloody sword in his hands and says that if it didn't have debuffs on it, he would be much stronger than him. After some time, Rude walks forward with the elf. She thanks him for saving her and says that she doesn't know what would have happened to her without him. He looks at her and says that he couldn't leave her there. Rude thinks that she doesn't show it, but the poison has really battered her. He says that he provided first aid as best he could. Besides, it's quite unusual to meet an elf in such a remote place. I wonder what happened to her that she has to run from bounty hunters. They turn their heads sharply and see a huge flying monster. Rude uses his skill and wonders if this is a moth boss. He scans the moth and sees all of its stats. Rude jumps towards the moth and says loudly that if it is healthy, it does not give it an advantage. He uses his air/skill and hits the ground with all his might with a beam. The elf girl manages to jump away from his beam. Rude turns towards her and makes sure she is safe. He kneels down and says loudly that he scared it and that it will get it badly now. Rude looks at the huge moth heading towards him and asks if it thinks that if it can fly, it will not get it. Rude holds his hand with the light coming from it near his face, and with a determined look says loudly that this is the air/skill. He directs the beam from his hand towards the moth. Blood begins to ooze from the wounds on his body. The moth looks forward with an angry expression and uses the skill Paralyzing Pollen. Rude looks at him with a smirk on his face and loudly says that it doesn't work. He looks at the elf with horror on his face and thinks that something will happen to her now. The elf girl holds her staff in her hand and looks forward with determination on her face. She hits a green beam from her staff towards the moth. They stand in a cave and look at the moth lying on the floor. Rude with surprise on his face thinks that this is wind magic, as expected from an elf. He plunges his sword into its head. The elf asks that neither poison nor paralysis work on him, and also his skills are the same as those of the local monsters. Rude proudly asks how to explain everything. She falls to the ground and he asks if the paralyzing scales really did affect her. The elf with beads of sweat running down her face says that something is different. She holds her staff in her hand and says that first they need to get out, and then she will tell him everything. After some time in the forest, they are sitting under the leaves of a tree. The elf girl with a smile on her face says that it is much better outside. Before she begins to explain the situation, she needs to introduce herself, and she says her name. Alicia says that she is an adventurer. Rude with surprise on his face asks loudly if she is really that same Alicia the Emerald Wind. She with a smile on her face asks if he has really heard of her. He loudly says that Alicia is from that S-rank team from the Kingdom of Lydia's Azure Train. Only if he remembers correctly, something happened to the Azure Trail. She says with a thoughtful face that it was 5 years ago, and the monsters crushed them. That day, they went out to fight against a monster of the deepest S-rank called the Labyrinth of the Abyss. Their leader died in that battle. Another member of the team retired due to injuries sustained. Another was swallowed up by the labyrinth itself. Alicia lowers the fabric of her dress a little and a mark is visible on her skin, with a pink light coming from it. She says that she also couldn't go out without getting injured. Rude is on one knee and loudly tells her to stop and asks what she's doing. He looks at her with confusion. Alicia shows her mark and says that it's a curse that has been on her ever since. A curse that lowers her level. Rude, with a surprised look on his face, says that he's never heard of such a thing. She holds her hands on the dark energy that is taking over her body and says that she didn't know about it either. She tried to remove it in many ways, but all she could do was slow down its progression. Those bounty hunters knew this very well and they wanted easy money. She would die anyway once her level dropped below 0. But she couldn't stand being at the mercy of such people. Rude, with a surprised look on his face, says loudly that it's a curse. It seems he can help remove it. He takes out his guild card and uses the substitution skill. It allows him to take on the injuries and debuffs received by the selected target. Rude says that they need to try something. He looks at Alicia and says that she should not resist the skill he is activating now. She responds with agreement. Rude puts his hand on her shoulder and a bright pink light begins to emanate from his hand. This is the substitution skill. Alicia looks at him in surprise and wonders if her curse is transferring to him. She says loudly in horror that she shouldn't do that. The curse will just transfer to him if he continues. Rude says with a smile on his face that it's okay, just trust him. He stands there, and behind him is a huge black monster covered in a pink aura. Alicia looks at it in horror. Rude closes his eyes and stands there with a smile on his face. He has activated the unique skill of debuff cancellation. The monster behind Rude broke into pieces due to the piercing yellow light. He looks at his hand and with a smile on his face thinks that it seems to have worked. Alicia with a surprised face asks what was just that. Rude says that she should check her status. She opens her stats and sees that her level is 43. Alicia with an embarrassed face says loudly that this can't be. Her curse has been lifted. He clenched his hand into a fist and with a smile on his face says that this is his unique skill of debuff removal. So he thought that it should work against the curse too. Alicia asks if he is an idiot? To risk so much for the first person he meets. She, with tears in her eyes from joy, loudly says that she is grateful to him. Rudd, with a smile on his face, looks ahead and puts his hand on her shoulder. Sometime later, under the evening sky, there is a restaurant. Alicia puts a wooden mug on the table. She, with a happy face, loudly says that it is cheap here, but at the same time the drinks are very tasty. And Rude knows a lot about choosing places. He, with a drop of sweat on his face, agrees and gives a thumbs up. Rude thinks that they were not even allowed into one place. He looks at Alicia and asks if she will be okay if she drinks so much. Just a couple of hours ago, she was badly injured. Alicia, with a smile on her face, looks at him and loudly says that she is recovering. She asks how one cannot drink on such a wonderful day. Rudd, with a calm look, drinks the drink and asks what she intends to do next. Alicia says that, to be honest, she would like to know a little more about him. She rests her head on her hand and asks him calmly how he decided to become an adventurer. He goes into his memories and says that the village he lived in was attacked by a monster. Because of those monsters, his family and friends died. But then, an S-rank adventurer suddenly appeared. He kills the monsters with a smile on his face and saves Rude. He will never forget his majestic appearance at that moment. Rude began to dream of becoming like him one day, so that he could save people too. Returning from his memories, he says with a smile on his face that this is his goal. Alicia looks at him and says that this is a wonderful goal. Rude asks that she will not even laugh. She holds a mug in her hands with a wide smile on her face and says that she herself dreamed of becoming an S-rank adventurer, even higher. Alicia planned to become even stronger until she was cursed. She is sure that her companions are still somewhere in the depths of the Abyss Labyrinth. Whatever the outcome, she wants to try to defeat that monster again. But right now, they don't have enough strength to achieve their goals. Alicia extends her hand to him and asks how about teaming up. He looks away and says he can't. Suddenly, an unknown person grabs Alicia's hand. Rude looks up and sees two happy guys. One of them says with a smile on his face that he has a really cute girl drinking with him. He seriously wonders if these are the idiots who beat him up in the restaurant. They look at Alicia and ask why she needs that boar. It would be better if she went with them. Rude grabs one of them by the shoulder and tells him to leave her alone. The guy grabs him by the clothes with displeasure and loudly tells him that he's an idiot. Alicia gets up from the table and says that they need to stop. This is a tavern, don't they know? She says with a big smile on her face that if they want to fight, they need to compete in who can outdrink the other. They drink beer for a long time and happily, until two guys pass out. Alicia says with a satisfied face that she won. Rude looks at her with a smile and gives her a thumbs up. They lean against the wall and he says that she held up well for someone who drank half a liter before the competition. Alicia looks at him with a dissatisfied face and says that he is her benefactor after all. She could not just watch when her benefactor was being poisoned. She falls on Rude's chest and falls asleep. He says with a smile on his face that there is nothing to be done about it and touches her shoulder using the substitution skill. Alicia wakes up in surprise and Rude says that he has nullified her hangover. She grabs his hand with a satisfied face and loudly says that first the curse and now the hangover. What a wonderful skill he has. They should definitely form a team. Alicia goes ahead and says that this is great, because now they can continue drinking. Rude looks at her with beads of sweat on his face and tells her not to get too drunk. She looks at the sign with a special dish and says that it is a pity that they cannot try it. The tavern owner in an apron looks at her and says that the places where they caught Barnuma are occupied by some kind of monster. He sent requests to the guild, but most of the adventurers are busy with work. The man looks at them and asks if they would like to take on this job. After some time at the Barnuma fishing grounds, they are sailing on a sailboat and looking ahead with smiles on their faces. Alicia loudly says that they need to get rid of this monster and try the special dish. Rude clenches his fist and closes his eyes, agreeing with her words. He looks away and sees someone splashing around in the water. Rude says with a smile on his face that they found it. This is the monster the tavern owner was talking about. They look down with frightened faces seeing many underwater monsters and think that this can't be. Rude uses his skill and learns the characteristics of the fish. One of them opens its mouth and a blue beam comes out of it. He stops the beam with his sword that breaks out of the water. All the Jernebs open their mouths and attack them. Rude stops the beams with his sword with a frightened face. He thinks that this is just a wall of fire and continuing to stand still is not an option at all. Rude crosses his arms trying to hide his face and jumps into the water. Alicia with a surprised face covers it with her hand from the splashes of water. He dives into the water where there are many Jernebs. Rude with a smirk on his face loudly tells them to swim here. All the monsters with open mouths swim up to him. He holds his hand from which yellow lightning comes out and uses the skill lightning cover. All the Jernebs get hit by the skill. Alicia looks at the sea and sees that the monsters started to float to the surface. Rude swam to the surface and inhaled air. Alicia is sitting in the boat and loudly calls him. He loudly says that everything is fine and thinks that there really are still freaks in the water. Those in the depths. But why don't they attack? Are they waiting for the moment, or are they protecting something here? Rude raised his hand and loudly says that he needs to dive deeper to find out what is going on here. He asks if she doesn't mind. Will you do one thing for him? Alicia with surprise on her face looks forward. After some time, a rope is tied around Rude's waist while he swims deeper. He thinks he figured it out right away because they don't attack, and they don't run away either. They're protecting something here. Rude looks at the bottom of the sea with a surprised expression and sees an unknown monster with many tentacles. He uses his appraise skill and learns the characteristics of the tentacles. Rude wonders if it's some kind of huge sea anemone or a hermit crab. Part of the tentacle's tentacle detaches and becomes a Jerneb. He wonders with a surprised expression, so it's the one that breeds the Jernebs? If he doesn't kill it, there's no point in getting rid of them. It doesn't seem to be going to attack right away, so it's best to prepare first. Rudd, with a horrified expression, feels something pushing him upward with great force. He sees that his leg is being held by a huge tentacle. Rudd, with beads of sweat on his face, surrounded by Jernebs, thinks that they are freaks. So the monsters did not attack him right away because they were trying to make him lower his guard. He squeezes the tentacles with his hands, from which yellow lightning comes and thinks that since this kind of fight has started, he can use his skill. Rude clenches his fists in front of his face, and all the fish are hit by lightning. He thinks that despite direct contact, he was not fried. Rude looks at the torn off part of the tentacles with surprise on his face, and thinks that this is definitely autonomy. He simply threw the tentacles away as soon as they were struck by lightning. This allowed him to avoid damage. A huge monster with bright red eyes headed towards Rudd. He thinks with a frightened face that he is already suffocating. Rude tugs at the rope tied to his body and thinks that he is counting on Alicia. She is standing in the boat and looks at the rope that has begun to tighten. Alicia takes her staff covered in green aura and thinks that he can give it to her. She pulls it out of the water. The monster hits the ground and looks at Rude, who is swimming, with a surprised expression on his face. After a while, he lies on the sand and holds his hands on his chest. Alicia asks if he is okay. Rude puts his hand on the back of his head, from which drops of water are dripping, and says that she saved him. He looks forward with a calm face and says that there's a boss underwater that endlessly breeds Jernibs. He regenerates very quickly, so he needs to return quickly. Alicia looks at him and says that underwater monsters have too much of an advantage underwater. Her magic will not reach there. She asks if he has any plan. Rude, with drops of water dripping down his face, looks down and says that there is one way, but he needs to decide. Alicia immediately told him about her curse and even offered to become a team. So he should also open up to her before it's too late. Rude kneels down and looks at the monster that came out of the water. He says that she shouldn't tell anyone about what she's about to see. Rude dives into the water and uses his speed swimming skill. He swims quickly towards the Jernib, shrouded in a blue aura, and cuts them with his weapon. The monster points its tentacles at him. Rude swims closer to the monster and wounds it with his weapon. He looks at it with a smirk on his face and says that it should disappear. Rude uses his lightning shroud skill and the entire area is illuminated by yellow light. Rude looks at the monster's corpse and says that now the fishing grounds will return to normal, but there is a problem in Alicia's face. He remembers what happened recently and thinks that she saw him eat the monster. I wonder how she felt about it and what she will say when he comes back. He emerges from the water and sees that there is no one on the shore. He smiles and thinks that why did he think that she would wait for him? But he hoped for this in vain. He is very surprised, because she asks him what took her so long. She comes out of the bushes with brushwood in her hands and says that it is good that at least he is not injured. Did he deal with the boss or not? He watches as she lays out branches for the fire and says that he defeated the monster. She says with a smile that she is glad about this, and she could not sit still while waiting for him. She decided to collect brushwood for the fire, because he will need to dry his clothes. He looks at her silently for a while and then asks if she really does not mind what she saw recently. She continued laying out brushwood and says that at first she was a little surprised by it. However, he trusted her to tell her the secret. And for her it means much more than anything. He sheepishly says he understands and thanks her. He pulls the net and says he wants to get that boss's skills, so he cuts himself a piece. And he also thought it would be weird if he were to eat alone. She rummages through the net with the remains of the monster, and she comes closer to him and asks what's in there. He happily pulls out a fish and says it's a barnama, and he captured it if she doesn't mind sharing her lunch with the monster. She happily says she'd be happy to eat with him. He smiles kindly, laughs, and says that while they're eating, he wants to tell her about the first time he tried a monster. After a while, she happily eats and says the fish is delicious. It's truly amazing that he eats monsters. However, he had good reasons, didn't he? He says that thanks to this, a weakling like him who is doomed to be ranked is one step closer to his dream. She says with a knowing look that besides this power was also used to help her deal with the curse and the bounty hunters. Maybe when it's cooked, the monster meat will taste even better. He asks her if monsters actually taste great, right? He doesn't need the Jernibs for skills anymore, but he'd like to try the cooked version. Would she like to try them as well? She says that unfortunately, there's no guarantee that she'll survive this, so it's best to refrain from it. She finishes eating and says that now she has something else to ask him. Would he like to team up with her? He sits in silence for a while, and then asks if she doesn't have any other useful connections with adventurers left. Alicia says with a sad look that she lived with the curse for 5 years, and those who haven't died in the labyrinths have retired, since human years are very limiting. And also adventurers who rush into labyrinths are mostly crazy. No matter how strong they are, she can't trust them with her back. She holds out her hand to him and says that to create a team you need someone you can trust with both your back and your innermost thoughts. For example, she can trust him with both. He was surprised by her words, then closed his eyes, smiled and said that he agreed and from now on they will be a team. After some time, Adventurers Guild branch in Balon. Alicia raised her hand up and says that they need to prepare for their first real work in a team. Rude with an emotionless look says that since he is ranky, they should not expect many requests. She goes forward and says that maybe so, but for now this will be enough. They walk into the guild and she hands her ID to the worker and says that they are now a team. Can she register them? She looks at her ID with a surprised look and asks if she is really an S-rank adventurer, Alicia Emerald Wind. She sees all her stats, unique skill, abilities and asks why she needs a filthy picker in her party. She approaches her with a questioning look and asks what she means. The worker gives her the paper and says that she understands everything. Alicia says that Rude still needs to raise his rank. What is he missing for a promotion? She looks at the papers and says that he has enough achievements, and only a combat check remains. Alicia happily says that then they need the highest level of cleansing requests so that the two of them can handle it. The worker says that she understands their request and at the moment there is a place in the vicinity of Balona where a pack of grey wolves needs to be eliminated. Rude ominously uses the skill concealment and attacks the pack from behind. One of the wolves howled and thus called for reinforcements. Rude went forward and said that he was leaving them to her. She uses a spirit and says that she understood him and asks Sylph to lend her her power. Rude looks at her in surprise and thinks that this is her unique skill, spirit magic. She asks a mighty wind to cut a path for them and destroys the wolves in front. He looks at the power of her skill with a stunned look and thinks that this is incredible power, and she left them no chance. She approaches him and says that most likely after the curse the strength will not return so quickly. She gives her a thumbs up and thinks that he is afraid to even think what a blow at full force would be. Suddenly he hears a sound and notices that a pack of wolves is attacking him from behind and he, not expecting this, thinks, where did so many of them come from? The wolf is almost close to him, and he thinks that he will not dodge its attack. Alicia calls out to Sylphide and after a while, she and Rude find themselves in the sky. He smiles and says that it's cool and that he didn't expect her to even do that. He thanks her for getting him out of trouble. She looks at Sylphide and says that she's the one to thank. She's wary and says that it seems like they can't let their guard down for a second. They look down and she says that there are 5 more hiding in the bushes and it's unknown how many more are hiding. He says that in that case, it's time for him to come out. She looks at him questioningly, and he uses his echolocation skill. He says that there are about 30 of them in total, and considering the ones they've already finished off, they'll reach their goal in no time. Sylph flies next to her, and Rude tells her to attack when he gives the sign. She attacks the wolves from above with her magic, and he thinks that the accuracy of echolocation is reduced in the open air, and even Alicia herself will not be able to accurately count how many there are. But if they attack in an area, they will be able to herd the grey wolves into one place. She exhales and says that she did her part, and the rest is on him. He approaches the wolves from behind and uses paralyzing pollen. After a while, he says that he counted 52 wolves in total. He sits next to a pile of wolf carcasses, and Alicia says that she can't even believe that they met so many monsters in one day. He says that there really are a lot of them. The magic she used was spirit magic, right? She confirms this and says that she can borrow the powers of spirits and cast their spells that exist in nature. Spirits are literally everywhere, although they don't show themselves often, and she has to pay for their powers with her mana. So without a significant supply of it, nothing will work, and as he could see, she is able to create a phenomenon of flight. She is sure that he has never seen such a strong wind magic. Sylph pulls Rude by the hair and he tries to fight her off and tells her to stop it. Alicia says with a smile that she likes to tease, and the more he reacts, the happier she is. She raises her finger up and says that it is already getting dark, and she would like to go back soon. She uses spirit flight magic, and says that they need to fly back. During the flight, Rude asks what other spirit magic she uses. She answers that her specialty is water, ice, light and earth, but the spirits of fire and darkness do not suit her. After all, if he has low compatibility with someone's spirit, then a lot of mana will be spent on control. They can also refuse to give their powers, and Sylph seems to like him. She pulls his ear and he asks irritably, does she really think so? She laughs and says that it is indeed so. They fly forward and Rude notices some smoke coming from the distance. It seems that there was a village in that direction. The village is on fire and monsters are walking around it, and a local adventurer asks, aren't grey wolves the only monsters in this area? Where did this monster Baphomet come from? He uses a spell and summons a fire spear, and it flies at the adventurers. Suddenly, his attack is stopped by a stream of water, and it turns out that it was Rude with the spirit of water, who used the skill Water Bullet. Alicia appears from behind them and asks if they are okay. They say that everything is fine and thank them. She says that they will deal with this monster, and they need to report the situation. Rude runs towards the monster and uses a praise on it. He sees that he is level 27 and has abilities, and he thinks that although his level is lower than that of the lizard commander, their stats are simply incomparable, which means this is not an ordinary monster. 4 spears appear behind his back, and Rude thinks that his skills and basics of combat are very impressive, although he himself can summon a little fire, but it is very weak and is completely unsuitable for combat. He attacks the monster in a jump and thinks that if he eats it, he will be able to shoot fireballs. He tries to hit him, but the monster blocks his blow, and Rude thinks, does he really have claws made of steel? If they are so strong, then it means he needs to strengthen himself. 4 spears are directed at him and a large explosion occurs from the attack. He jumps back and Alicia asks if he is okay. He confirms this and thinks that he has several fire spears that he actively throws, but 2 charges are always kept for defense, a difficult opponent. She says that the monster is very prudent, and they need to exchange information while they can. She thinks that the villagers are still here. She asks those guys to organize an evacuation, and she also would not like to add to the destruction here. She still won't be able to defeat him with one powerful magic volley. He thinks that Alicia's mana supply must have already been depleted from the previous fight and flight, so there is no need to count on spirit magic, and he needs to come up with something himself. She says that she will cover him from magic and asks him to trust her. He seriously thinks that no matter what happens, he will continue to attack. Alicia uses water spirit magic and removes the flames in a small area. Rude thinks that when magic of the same level but opposite attributes clash, both charges are cancelled. The monster begins to use a spell with rage and points its hands at Rude. Alicia tells him to attack further, and he makes a dash forward. He fights off the rocks and thinks, is he really using precision shooting with rocks of the same mass? She saves mana by not allowing incoming damage. It's such a precise magic control, as expected from a former S rank. He jumps with his sword raised on his shoulder and uses a surge of strength. With one blow, he cut off his fingers and the monster gets angry, and Alicia uses fire magic and mockingly asks, does he really not like his own flame? The villagers look on in surprise, and the red-haired adventurer says that he heard an explosion and a terrible howl. Did the adventurers really manage to defeat that creature? The bald guy apologizes and says that if only he hadn't been injured, he could have helped them. Everyone looks on in surprise as Alicia comes up to them, saying that she is grateful to them for handling the evacuation. The red-haired guy approaches her and says that he didn't expect her to be okay. She gives him a thumbs up and says that she is alive and Baphomet is not. She dealt the fatal blow, but if he managed to survive, he can attack again, so they need to prepare. She says that she has one request of them. The red-haired guy presses his hand to his chest and says that they will do anything. She asks with an embarrassed look if they have any food and if they can share it. Sometime later, on the outskirts of the village, in the forest, Rude is sitting next to a fire and the carcass of a monster, and suddenly Alicia comes out of the bushes and says that she is back. He smiles and says that he is glad to see her here. How are the villagers? She approaches him and says that everyone was successfully taken out, thanks to those adventurers. She told them that they still have to finish off Baphomet, so he has time to process the corpse. He says he's sorry for the inconvenience, and thanks her. He licks his lips and says it looks delicious. He shows a pot full of meat and says the soup and Baphomet are ready. He adds some mugwort and ginger and tries the soup. He eats a spoonful of the soup with a satisfied look and says that although it smells like lamb, if you close your eyes it's a real delicacy. The system tells him that he's gaining several skills. Alicia says that although it looks delicious, she doesn't like it a little when a human eats a humanoid monster. He becomes sad and says that she's right, and what's even scarier is that he's used to it. They notice that a pack of wild boars suddenly comes out of the bushes. She is surprised by this, and Rude asks if there aren't too many monsters here. He gets up and says that if that's the case then it's time to debut as a mage. He puts his hand forward and points it towards the boars. They continue to stand silently, because nothing happened, but suddenly a boar runs at him. He did not expect it, but dodges. After that the boar knocks over his food. She says with a puzzled look that she thought that he was about to cast a spell. He looks down and says that his mana is running out, so he will not be able to support properly, but he is not going to forgive them. He killed a lot of time to get rid of the blood and guts. He wanted to enjoy the dish, so he worked very carefully on the taste. He got very angry and says that they will answer for this with their flesh. Suddenly Alicia pulls him by the collar and says that he should calm down, because the skill that they use is an attack. It gives such a significant acceleration force that everything in their path simply flies apart. And they better break the distance or get to a place where the attack can't reach them, so they need to run. A few hours later, they're sitting in a tree with 3 boars underneath them, and she says she thinks they've already broken away. She whispers to him what kind of magic was that, and why didn't it work? He looks down and says he's never had a skill not work before. She puts her finger up and asks why doesn't he just check everything with the appraisal first? He looks at her in surprise and says she's right. He looks at the abilities with the appraisal and says it says he should have figured out how to use them himself. She thinks about it and says if he can't use them, that only means one. His brain is simply unable to comprehend magic and he is out of luck. He says in a sad voice that her words are too cruel. She thinks even more and says that, however, he still activated fire magic at a weak level. So her explanation does not give a clear understanding of why his magic does not work at all. Suddenly, an idea comes to her and she asks if in order to use monster magic, he first needs to learn to control their mana. He says that he understood what she wanted to tell him. She says that she does not know much about monster mana, but since he absorbs the power of monsters, it might work. He points his hand forward and says that he wants to try. He closes his eyes and thinks that he needs to remember everything from the moment he first tasted monster meat. He remembers the past and thinks that if he can recreate that flash of power in his body, then maybe that will be the key. She looks at him with a stunned look. He opens his eyes and looks forward in surprise and sees that he has succeeded. He thinks that as long as he can feel the mana, he can use it like a part of his body. He directs all his power at the boars and a huge explosion occurs. All the boars die and he cooks a new dish from their corpses. He whistles a tune and says that he is making pork cutlets from minced meat. He raises his hand up and says that he apologizes to her for making her wait. She says that he shouldn't worry and she already knows how important this is to him. But in her mind she thinks that at the same time, his face at this moment really pisses her off. She says that in order for him to use magic, he needs monster mana, not regular mana. It doesn't seem like the previous attack took away any mana points from him at all, so he can cast magic continuously. He remembers that feeling and says that when he felt the mana flowing through his body, he immediately understood how he should use skills. If monster mana is equivalent to human mana, then it means that he can strengthen his body or weapon with it. There are quite a lot of adventurers who develop magical power. There are also those who use it in close combat, because the circulation of mana throughout the body allows you to increase their physical characteristics. The same goes for weapons, their damage increases. If you go further, you can also emit cuts. She looks up and says that it became clearer to her and because his personal mana reserve was meager, he could not use these skills, right? He agrees with her, takes the meat with tongs and says that now he has more than enough monster mana, but what is even more important, he replenishes it simply by eating their flesh. He eats a piece and the system informs him that a new offensive skill is available to him. She thought about it and mentally says that he gets mana from food and is even able to store it in his body. She looks at the food with drool from her mouth and thinks that the most important thing is that these cutlets look unrealistically appetizing. She thought about it and asked her if she wanted to try them. She turned away with an embarrassed look and said that it was better not to. Suddenly something hit next to them, and they looked inquiringly in that direction. They saw that a large boar was standing next to them and Rude said that he thought that the boss had arrived. The boar quickly approached them and Alicia, who did not expect such speed from him, thought that he was very fast. Rude used the offensive and taking her with him, they escaped the blow. He threw her away. She said that he really helped her out. She thought that she had only just managed to sense him from a distance, when he was already right in front of her. How did this happen? They are not even in a labyrinth. Where did such a monster come from in this place? He said in a trembling voice that his precious food was spoiled again. He pointed a finger at the boar and asked loudly if he was really asking for trouble. Rude stood silently for a while and then said that it would be perfect if he put him on the roast. Although this monster clearly has resistance to fire, even if you pour oil on it and set it on fire, it will not care. He sees in the system that the boss is level 38 and has pretty high stats. He uses the earth magic skill and thinks that his only skills are offensive and fire resistance. He creates a stone fist and loudly says that the boar must know the retribution of a gourmet. The boar runs through the stone and Rude, who did not expect that he would do this, falls for his attack and is thrown into a tree. Alicia loudly shouts his name and uses sylph magic to attack the boar. She thinks that although she managed to hit him, but this is not even a skill, purely the durability of the skin and muscles. Whether it is earth magic or spirits, both of them are not powerful enough to break through this boss. The boss is about to attack, but suddenly stops, because Rude uses the roar skill. He tells him not to dare look away, because he is not finished yet. It is disadvantageous to use offensive or impenetrability, but if you try to fight by attrition, he will simply switch to Alicia. It is a pity that he does not have a skill that can finish him in one blow. However, he also does not know how to do anything except rush forward. He closes his eyes and thinks that he will try to use this skill for the first time. He raises the sword above his head and blows, that he has to start sometime. First, he needs to direct mana along the body and imagine how he fills the sword with it. The boss ran up to him closely and he cuts him with his sword. He looks at the trace of his attack and says that he did it. Alicia asks him with a surprised face if he really used mana to strengthen the weapon. After all, he did it even without practice. He shows a thumb and says that he knew it was possible, so he decided to try it. He wanted to say something else, but he heard the sounds of cracking. His sword fell apart, and they look at it in surprise. Rude looks at his sword lying on the ground and says that nothing can be done, and that it served him well. Alicia says that it simply couldn't withstand the mana that was poured into it. A sword is like a body part for an adventurer, and he seems to be in great shock. He says that it's time to finish today's business, and that we need to cut some meat off the boar. Poisonous Labyrinth, 7th floor. Adventurers are fighting poisonous rats, and one of them says that they are the highest level of the rat species, and that they are not easy opponents. The adventurer with the sword says that they are no obstacle to their team. The fat adventurer raises his hand and says that he agrees with him. The guy with the sword turns around questioningly, and the mage asks if something is wrong. He moves away from the team and says that nothing happened and that he thought he heard something there. The chubby guy asks where the stairs came from in such a place. The mage with a cheerful expression asks if there is a secret passage here. The guy with the sword says that they should go and see what's there. After a while, having gone down, they find a room with a chest, and everyone looks at it in surprise. They come closer to it, and one says that it doesn't look like a trap. The magician asks him if there is really treasure there. He takes out the sword and they look at it with satisfied faces, and the guy who holds the sword says that it looks pretty powerful. He feels like magical power is pouring out of it. He thinks that it can probably be sold for a lot of money. The fat guy asks him if he is sure that this sword is not cursed. The magician holds him by the shoulder and tells him not to be such a bore. After all, if you judge by it, the evil spirit has not been seen for a long time, so they had to look for other ways to make easy money. And this is just a gift for all their efforts. The guy with the sword says that they have been hanging around here for the second night in a row. Let this be their gift. The fat guy says that he saw an unclean picker in the company of an incredibly beautiful elf. The guy with the sword says that he is too impudent for a picker. The magician says that the next time they meet him, they will need to teach him a lesson so that he knows his place. The fat guy stops and stares at the chest. An evil aura emanates from the sword, and he says that he needs to kill someone. The border town of Ballona. Rude cheerfully says that he wants to consult with his friend, the owner of a weapon shop, about a new sword. The weapon shop is the dwarf's hammer. The owner, Doim, looks thoughtfully and says that he did not expect that the sword he forged would crumble so easily. After all, even the most brute physical force would not have brought it to such a deplorable state. He looked at Rude and asked him what he filled this sword with. Elisha approached him and whispered, "What is he going to tell him?" He says that he will explain everything to him, because he has known old man Doim for a long time, and he is not one to blab other people's secrets. They sit at the table, and he thoughtfully holds his beard and asks, "Does eating monsters give him the ability to obtain their power?" No wonder his abilities have skyrocketed. Elisha asks him, "Does this not surprise him at all?" Doim asks, "If it tastes good to him, then what difference does it make what he eats? What's more important now is that it's unclear where to get a sword that can withstand that kind of mana, right?" From what he knows, creating such a sword isn't a quick task. Rude puts his hand forward and asks if he needs anything to make it. He says that high-quality magic stones would help him. He looks into his bag and says that he has several of those stones with him. He puts 3 monster stones on the table, and the old man calls them by name, and says that his skills have really improved a lot. Rude holds the back of his head and says with a satisfied look that his praise means especially much to him. Doim says that if he needs anything else, he will contact him. He gives him the sword and says that for now, he will use it. Rude thanks him and is about to take it, but the old man stops him and says that he should under no circumstances pour mana into it. Doim with an evil aura says that if he breaks this sword too, he will shake an exorbitant compensation from him. After some time, a tavern. Elisha is sitting at the table and asks if they can give up magical attacks for now. He is sitting with a mug and asks if the old man really is scary when it comes to weapons, right? She laughed and said that although it was on business, she was glad to meet his friend for the first time in a long time. He sheepishly says that he apologizes for being such a loner. A mage appears from behind Elisha and asks if he is still having fun. All 3 guys are standing behind her, and he says that they want to join them. She gets up from the table and asks if they really have any problems. She suggests solving them with drinks, like real adventurers. The guy with the sword shakes his hand and he falls on the table. Everyone is surprised by this, and the mage asks if he really managed to get drunk alone. Suddenly he notices something and asks if he really didn't sell that sword. The guy starts saying over and over that he's going to kill them and that they need to shut up. He attacks the mage with a scary aura and wounds him, then he turns around and swings at Elisha. Rude parries his attack and says that it seems like the issue won't be resolved with a drink. Rude thinks what happened to that guy. The tavern patrons tell him that he needs to leave because that's not how he should behave here. They hold his hands, but he breaks free and attacks them. Elisha apologizes to the manager and says that she'll have to knock down the wall. She knocked the wall down with her attack and threw the guy far away. Rude asks what's wrong with him. She looks at him in surprise and sees that even after her attack, he stood up. Rude asks her if she really held back. After all, the average adventurer shouldn't be able to stand up even after that. The guy stands up in a cloud of smoke and runs towards them screaming that he will kill them. Rude runs towards him saying that things are bad. Elisha says that if anyone has healing magic, they should start healing immediately. They cross swords and the system reports that Rondo is insane. Rude thinks that he has gone berserk and the Rondo he remembers was nowhere near that stat. Suddenly, Elisha yells at him to move away. He turns around and sees that she is casting a spell and says that this time she will hit with full force. She attacks him, but he absorbs it all with his sword and the sword entangles his hand. Elisha yells at Rude to be careful because his sword is cursed. He asks if he only gets stronger by absorbing magic, right? He attacks him, and it is already difficult for him to fight off his blows. Rude cut his leg, but notice that black and red tentacles are covering his wounds. Elisha thinks that if she tries to support him with magic, the sword will probably suck her in again. If she wants to help him, then she needs to wait for the moment and do a reverse maneuver. A fat guy comes out of the tavern and says that they spared his friend, and although they did not really get along, but for him, who could only amuse himself with the fact that there was someone weaker than him, Magnus and Rondo are the only rays of light. He tearfully says that he asks him to spare his life. Rude jumps back, turns to him and says that he will try his best. He says that he wants to try a substitution and she should not interfere yet. He thinks that when he used substitution on Alicius, it only took 10 seconds. But the problem is that he needs to somehow hold him down all this time while he tries to remove the curse. He gets thrown back by his attack and he thinks that it will be really hard. However, if he tries to use a skill, he will most likely be able to block his sword. He uses a book on the basics of earth magic. If the reason for his status is the curse, he will be able to purify it, like in the case of Alicius. However, he can purify it, like in the case of Alicius, there is a chance that he will return to normal. He uses the substitution skill and Rondo asks to be saved. The mage heals Marcus and the fat guy calls his friend by name with tears in his eyes. Rondo asks to be saved, but when Rude tried to do the substitution, he was thrown back. Alicia approaches him and asks if he is okay. He says that he is okay, but the substitution failed. And it's not that Rondo reflected his skill, it's the cursed sword. Maybe if he weakens it a little more, something will work. Rude points his hand at Rondo and uses fire magic basic skill. It hits him and thinks that he was able to free only his left hand from the curse. He needs to stay out of reach of his right hand. Rondo runs awkwardly towards him and Rude thinks why is he moving so strangely. He defends himself from fire magic again, and he thinks that more importantly, it absorbed his magic again. Suddenly the sword is covered in a black aura and Rondo is completely covered in tentacles. Rude looks at it and thinks that this is an incarnation. He uses appraisal and thinks that now this body is no longer Roland's. The monster attacks him but he dodges. He is about to attack it but the monster throws him away. Rude flew back from its attack and thinks that he no longer makes unnecessary movements, like a seasoned fighter. Graham appears behind him and attacks him. Alicia approaches the monster, and she thinks that she needs to gather all the remaining mana in her body. She throws him back a little and attacks him with her magic and she asks, did she come in time, right? Rude is on his knees and says that he is grateful to her for her help, and he did not think that she knew how to fight in close combat. She says that a wizard who is useless if the enemy gets close will be a burden for his team, but one way or another, one cannot let down his guard against such an enemy. He will have to decide, because Rondo's curse has already grown too much, and it may not be possible to stop it without piercing the heart. He thought and closed his eyes, then got into a fighting stance and said that he understands it. Marcus goes forward and the mage who treated him says that he cannot move and he is preventing him from treating his wounds. He goes to Rigard and asks if he heard what the elf said. Rude defends himself from the monster's attacks and thinks that even if they attack together, they can't get close. Do two heads really give him such a wide view? He says loudly that Alicia should move away. He uses a skill and she thinks that she understood the essence of his plan. He raises dust with magic, limiting visibility, and the monster will not be able to implement it. He quickly attacks the smoke monster with dashes and it no longer reacts so quickly. Alicia uses earth spirit magic and thinks that her blow only grazed its heart. The monster breaks away from her attack and attacks her. Suddenly Rigard and Magnus push it away. Rude did not expect this and Rigard says that he will stop it even if it kills him. Magnus cries in tears that the three of them will always be together. He makes a dash and pierces the heart of his former comrade with a blade. Magnus thrusts his sword into the heart of the curse that had captured his friend, and the monster begins to scream very loudly. He cries because he had to do this and blood flows from the monster's wound. They all fall to the ground together, and the curse begins to disappear. Rondo's body, which was captured by this curse, was very badly mutilated and there was almost nothing left of it. Rude and Alicia look at what is happening with sad faces and say nothing. Magnus and Rigard are kneeling and crying because of the death of their friend. Rude turns around and silently looks at something. He approaches the cursed sword, which is lying on the ground. He took it in his hand and thinks that even if he closes this thing somewhere deep, it will not be able to protect it from new victims. A very strong dark energy begins to emanate from the sword and the voice of the curse says that it must kill. The system notifies that the curse has been neutralized with the help of the debuff cancellation skill. Rude, with a calm expression on his face, tells the freak that he should shut up. His magic won't work on him. Their attention is drawn to Lockhars, who came out of the building with several people. He asks loudly with a surprised look if they are okay. He notices Rondo's badly injured body lying on the ground and Rude says that it is already over. Lockhars looks at them silently for a few seconds and says that they should go to the guild to tell him everything in detail. After that, in his office, he sits at his desk and asks, so the cursed sword increased his abilities several times? He is sure that Magnus' testimony will be enough for the other adventurers to be wary of picking it up. He calls Rude and asks how he feels. He looks at the cursed sword that he hung on his belt and says that it is not affected by curses due to its debuff cancellation. He wants to keep the sword for himself so that no one else will get hurt. Lockhars looks at him with a serious look and says that he understands it. However, if the cursed sword can still get hold of him. Rude says with a calm face that if this happens, then they must do what needs to be done. Alicia stands next to him and says nothing. Lockhars calls them by name and says that he is grateful to them for settling this incident. And he offers his condolences to Magnus and Rigard. Still, it is not time to relax yet. Alicia asks, did something else happen? He looks at several guys standing with him in the office and says that these adventurers he brought were called for a special occasion. A large number of monsters broke out of the labyrinth. The source, it is the same new labyrinth in the Avelio Mountains. He questioned the adventurers who caught the invasion. It seems that the whole thing is due to the presence of a special monster. Rude asks with a serious face, what kind of special monster is it? Lockhart says it is a poisonous dragon, Basilite. He himself only knows about this monster from books. Its level is about 70. His combat skills alone are no joke, but the problem is that he pollutes the environment extremely quickly. He believes that this pollution is what is forcing other monsters to leave the labyrinth. Even adventurers were affected. All the witnesses who returned are currently undergoing treatment. If this continues, it will not be limited to just one monster invasion. The pollution will spread beyond the labyrinth. Their lands will be irreparably damaged. That is why he was looking for him. Rude says with a calm face that he understands everything. They should let him examine the returned adventurers. Sometime later, in the infirmary of the Adventurer Guild, Rude examines a guy who is lying on a bed. He is in great pain and breathing heavily. He puts his hand on the guy's chest and uses the substitution skill. Lockhars looks at what is happening with a surprised look and says that this is simply unbelievable. Rude smiles and looks at the guy who has gotten better and the poison he took disappears in his hand. Lockhars looks at him in surprise and says that he didn't know that he could nullify other adventurers' debuffs as well. Rude says that he can only do that if the target doesn't reject the effect. They should do it this way. He and Alicia will deal with the poisonous dragon. The adventurer looks surprised and says that trying to kill that dragon with just 2 people is just crazy. Lockhart asks with a serious look how they rate their chances. Rude says that the fewer people he has to clear, the easier it will be to achieve the goal. A confident smile appears on his face, and he says that he himself knows that he is good at fighting a strong enemy one-on-one. Lockhart thinks about it for a few seconds in silence, pats him on the shoulder, and says that it sounds brave, but he still agrees. He trusts him to clear the dungeon of the poisonous dragon Basilith. After some time, Rude walks down the street and says that they need to get a good night's sleep to prepare. Alicia looks at him and asks if he really thinks that the 2 of them can handle this. Rude says with a smile that she herself understands that he won't be able to use all of his skills in the presence of outsiders. He is silent for a few seconds with a guilty look and says that he would like to apologize for dragging her into this without even asking. Alicia looks at him with a smile and asks what kind of nonsense is this. She would rather beat him up if he went there without her. They are a team after all, which means that the 2 of them are enough to handle this. Sometime later, on the lower floors of Avilio's labyrinth, a level 20 goblin with poison applied to him attacks someone with his club. The system window says that his health is 123 points, mana 74 points, strength 107 points, will 81 points, tenacity 92 points, and agility 96 points. Enhancement and baton skills. Rude kills the monster with 1 swift sword strike. He puts the sword on his shoulder and says that everything is as the victim said. They will need to go down 5 more floors. He would never have thought that the poison would spread so far. Alicia agrees and says that the speed at which it is spreading is off the charts. Even her purification items are having a harder and harder time dealing with the poison. It seems that not all the monsters on the floor below survive this. Rude says that he does not know exactly how many more floors they have left. She is sure that she does not want to. Alicia does not let him finish his question by saying that she is sure of it. What if he does not have enough strength to defeat the monster? Even if it comes to a direct confrontation, she is sure that she can land a few blows. Besides, if she is forced to run away again, leaving her friends, she will never forgive herself. Rude looks at her and says that he apologizes for making her remember that again. He touches her shoulder and activates the skill. She looks at her with a surprised look as the dark energy from her transfers to him. He says with a smile that he will replace her poison status. He removes his hand. Because of this, the dark energy no longer transfers to him, and says that everything is as he thought. He can cleanse it with just 1 touch, but as soon as he lets go, the poison starts to accumulate again. Alicia takes his hand with a smile, and says that then they will continue on their way, holding hands. She can hardly see the way anyway because of the clouds of poison, so in addition to the replacement, she could use a guide. Rude looks at her with a smile, and says nothing for a few seconds. They continue on and he says that he understands her. Sometime later, on the middle floors of the Avilio labyrinth, he says that the lower they go, the denser the couples become. He used echolocation and there seemed to be 2 monsters straight ahead. Alicia said that if they could survive all that poison, they weren't just any normal opponents. Rude said that seemed to be the case. He didn't think he'd encountered monsters like that before. She asked if there was some way they could get around them. He said they could, but he'd rather fight them. Alicia turned and glared at him. She asked if it was because of his appetite. Rude said it wasn't that, but he did wonder. He looked at the cursed sword, Graham, with a smile, and said that he wanted to experience that before he met the poisonous dragon. The system window said that anyone who touched the cursed sword would go mad and gain the insanity status. After a while, they encountered 2 level 33 monsters called tumbleweeds, with the poison status. Stats: health 161, mana 151, strength 127, will 192, stamina 214, agility 205. Skills: impenetrability, roll, poison resistance, vapor resistance and paralysis resistance. Rude points his hand towards them and creates a bright magic circle. Magical energy begins to be released from underground near the monsters, which destroys the floor. He uses the skill of Earth Magic Basics and throws these monsters into the air. Alicia looks at what happened in surprise and says that it worked great. Rude looks at these monsters and says that in fact, it seems like they were not damaged at all. The monsters look at them and start screaming very loudly. One of these bugs folded its legs and began to roll very quickly towards them. Rude asks loudly if she can stop it. Alicia happily says that he can rely on her. But she will have to let go of his hand for a while. She calls a spirit with a smile, which she calls Nomiya. This spirit starts using magic, and she points her hand at the monster and says loudly that she must intercept this thing. After that, a large hand made of stone appeared from under the ground, with which she caught this monster. Alicia apologizes and says that she won't be able to hold it in for long. Rude grabs his sword and says that he understands her, then he will test this sword right now. He directs his energy into the sword and thinks that it may not even think about breaking it. He runs very quickly next to the monster, and with a very strong blow destroys the stone hand and hits the enemy. Because of this attack, a huge bug fell to the ground and blood flowed from its wound. Rude turns to this monster, and with a dissatisfied look thinks that the cut was not deep enough. At the same moment, the second bug, which is standing in front of him, begins to scream very loudly. Rude raises his sword and thinks that since his efforts are not enough, he should take advantage of the opportunity. He stands with the sword above his head and loudly calls out to Alicia. She concentrates her energy in her hand with a smile, and says that she understood him. She points her hand towards him and releases a magical wave. The sword that Rude holds above his head begins to absorb all this magical energy. A red aura begins to emanate from the eye on the hilt of the sword. A huge beetle jumps on him while he is gathering all the energy into the sword. Rude looks at the monster in front of him with a smile and thinks that Graham should show him his full power. He makes several very fast strikes with the sword in which he concentrated his energy, and cuts the monster into many pieces. Rude turns around and looks at the trembling monster that he injured earlier. He walked up to the beetle and finished it off with a sword strike to the head. Rude walks up to Alicia and says that her magic control is as precise as expected. She happily gives a thumbs up and says that they did well. Rude takes her hand and uses the substitution skill. He asks if they should stay here for a while. He looks away and says that his mana is not restored by absorbing from the environment. Alicia says that he could have just said that he wanted to eat. Rude is confused and says that it is not like that. He wanted to cut off a piece and take it with him. He takes a piece of meat and fries it with fire magic. He tastes the meat and says that it has an unusual taste. Alicia asks, so what is that cursed sword actually like? Rude says that if he pours enough magic power into it, its physical capabilities will definitely increase greatly. Alicia asks, also, it does not break when he pours his mana into it, right? Rude agrees and says that he is just worried about the fact that from eyewitness accounts, the poisonous dragon is the size of the world tree. He wonders if this sword will be effective. In terms of normal attacks, his old sword was better. His attention is drawn to Graham saying that he should give it to him. Rude is very surprised by this and wonders, does the cursed sword want meat? He refuses and says that he meant a stone. He should give him a magic stone. Right after that he held Alicia with one hand to continue using the skill, and with the other hand he started searching for the magic stone in the monster's body. He took out the stone and held it out to the sword. Graham releases tentacles from his eye and grabbed the magic stone. He absorbed it, and a very bright energy starts coming from him. Rude laughs and looks at how the sword in his hands gets bigger. He looks at the enlarged blade of the sword and says that it has become so huge. Alicia looks at him and asks how he knew about this. Rude says that he hears the voice of the sword in his head. He looks at Graham and wonders if he got mad because he compared it to another sword. They go further into the labyrinth, and he says that he learned a lot about how to use the cursed sword. Alicia says that the floor below the poisonous dragon was last seen. Suddenly they hear a very loud roar, and this made them worry. A strong earthquake begins and Rude asks loudly, did the poisonous dragon do this? He looks up and says that it seems like the ceiling is about to collapse. They need to support this with earth magic. Alicia says loudly that if they only protect themselves, then the further path will be blocked and they will miss the poisonous dragon. She calls on the spirit of the wind and says loudly that then, they need to make it before the ceiling collapses. They fly forward very quickly, and she says loudly that they need to break through faster. They fly through the corridor, while large stone slabs fall around them. At the very last moment, they manage to fly through the door and stones fly behind them. Rude thanks her and says that he already thought he was going to die there. Alicia says with a smile that she used very little power. They look around and say that it is very dark on this floor. He says that he can use thermal imaging and they will continue to search for the enemy slowly. He uses the skill and his attention is drawn to what is ahead. He says that it seems to be just approaching them. He thinks that this is the poisonous dragon, Basilith. The system window says that this monster is level 75. Stats: Health 524 points, Mana 377 points, Strength 445 points, Will 365 points, Stamina 422 points, Dexterity 201 points. Skills: Intimidation, Resistance to Pollution, Poison, Fire, Lightning, Earth, Darkness, Petrification, Paralysis and Decay, Poisonous Fangs, Sting, Fumes and Claws, Night Vision, Dragon Scales, Earth and Darkness Magic Basics. Rude says that this monster is level 75. He is not very agile, but his health is over 500. Alicia looks at him and asks, what about skills? Rude says that he has poisonous claws and fangs. He is about to say something else, but he stops because of a very loud scream of the dragon. He looks at the dragon standing in front of them and realizes that it has noticed them. Alicia loudly asks if it has resistance to magic. Rude loudly agrees and says that fire, lightning, and darkness will not work. Alicia lets go of his hand and says that she will use other attributes, and he will lead. Rude agrees to this and the dragon once again lets out a very loud cry. He says loudly with a determined expression that they must do this. He begins to run towards the dragon through the cloud of poison and thinks that he wanted to keep his distance and observe until he figures out its attack pattern. However, he does not know how long Alicia will last in such thick poison. He would really like to end this quickly. He notices a bright light that was visible even through the clouds of poison. The dragon releases a very strong flame from its mouth and Rude uses the skill offensive, after which he jumps to the side. A very strong stream of flame flies near him and destroys everything in its path. Alicia looks at it with a surprised expression and thinks, did it melt the pillar and the floor? What a fierce heat. Basilith notices that he runs away and directs a stream of flame after him. Alicia looks at what is happening with a worried expression and loudly calls out to Sylphid. Rude looks down with a surprised expression and notices wind magic that has appeared next to him. He starts running very fast towards the dragon with a smile, which is trying to hit him with a stream of flame. He runs very fast next to Basilith and strikes her leg with his sword. His hand is shaking badly after the strike and he thinks that this dragon's scales are very strong. His strike only left a small cut due to the dragon's scales skill. He doesn't think that he can break through with the sword, but his magic won't help against this monster either. He loudly calls out to Alicia and she immediately releases several wind attribute magic attacks. Her attacks hit the dragon's paw and it attracts his attention. She looks at Basilith with a shocked expression and asks, even spirit magic does so little damage? She sees that there are only small cuts left on the dragon's paw. The dragon swings its tail and many spikes come out from it. Rude and Alicia notice this and look with surprised faces. Basilith makes a sharp blow with its tail, destroys the column and launches many poisonous spikes. They put a lot of force and block these spikes. Rude uses the skill Impenetrable, thanks to which he was able to protect himself and thinks that this dragon has a very high defense stat and also has long-range attacks. How can they defeat it? Alicia loudly calls him and says that he must buy her some time. Before her stats drop, she uses her special move. Rude immediately got into a fighting stance and says that he understands her. The dragon looks at Alicia, who at this time is concentrating on the magic attack and closed her eyes. She flies up and Basilisk begins to concentrate flames in his mouth to attack. Rude looks at this and immediately uses the skill Earth Magic Basic. With this skill, he creates several stone fists on the floor, which he uses to attack the dragon in the stomach. Rude jumped very high and flew towards Basilith's head. He delivered a very strong blow with his sword to the head of this huge monster, who was about to release flames from his mouth. Because of this attack, the monster lowered its head and released a stream of flames under its feet. Alicia continues to prepare for the attack and thinks that she will give up defense and rely on him. He will heal her with the substitution skill, so she will put all her mana into this attack. She summons the fire spirit Salam, and Rude at this time uses the manipulation skill to dodge the monster's attack. She summons the water spirit Erdal, and he dodges Basilith's attack with his tail. She summons another spirit, which she calls Nomiya and Wakian. The dragon senses that she is about to use very strong magic and turns to her. Alicia does not react to this in any way and continues to prepare to use magic. Basilith uses the skill Dark Magic Foundation to create several magic circles from which magical spears emerge. He launches this magic at Alicia to stop her attack. Rude manages to stand in front of her at the last moment, and uses Graham to absorb this dark magic. She loudly says that everything is ready, so he should step aside. He immediately does what she said and steps aside. Alicia releases a very strong beam of energy using the skill Quintet Spirits. Basilith stands still and looks at this magical attack, which is approaching him very quickly. Her attack hits this monster, and because of this, a very strong explosion occurs. She leans on her staff due to fatigue and says that in the past, she could have defeated a monster like this with one blow. Basilith was seriously injured by this attack, but still stands on his feet and looks at them. Rude puts his hand on her shoulder, uses the skill substitution, and says that it was a great blow. He walks on with a smile, and says that it's his turn now. The very badly injured dragon looks at him, and does nothing as blood flows out of his mouth. Alicia says that she's sorry that he had to use substitution on her again, but she really gave it her all with that last attack. Rude says that it's okay, she just has to use the rest of her mana to defend herself. She can leave the rest to him. Alicia starts using her magic to create a barrier, and says that he has to be careful. Rude agrees and walks towards that huge monster. Basilith looks at him with his remaining eyes and waits for his action. The dragon opens its mouth wide and lets out a very loud roar. Rude takes a very deep breath and lets out a very loud roar using his skill. The dragon was taken aback by this and looks at him in surprise. He starts running towards that monster with great speed with his sword in his hands. He remembers the past and thinks that it seems that he Basilith put a lot of mana into his attack with darkness magic. He runs under the dragon's feet, strikes with his sword and thinks that the power is overflowing him. This time his attacks were able to do more damage, and he pierces the dragon's scales. Rude looks at this with a smile and says that his scales have crumbled. Now it will be much easier for him to injure him. He runs very quickly under Basilith's belly and strikes many quick blows with his sword. He notices that his sword is becoming less and less effective. The mana that Graham absorbed gradually runs out. The dragon is very angry about what is happening and begins to roar loudly and angrily. He opens his mouth and uses the skill Poisonous Fumes. Rude is thrown back by this attack and his attention is drawn to this cloud of poison. He notices another attack of this monster and thinks that although he is resistant to poison, but in addition to this, he also attacks with spikes. He looks at it with a worried look and realizes that he won't be able to dodge it. He uses the skill Offensive and runs away, but is surprised to see Basilith attacking him with its paw. At the very last moment, Rude activates the skill Impenetrable and takes this very strong attack. The dragon finishes its attack and throws him very hard into the wall. After this strong blow, he wonders if he really calculated the length of his dash. He gets up on his feet, looks at Basilith standing in front of him, and thinks that the dungeons never cease to amaze him. Alicia looks at him with a worried look and loudly calls his name. Rude holds onto his feet with the last of his strength, immersing himself in memories and thinks that this reminds him of the time he almost died. He begins to use earth magic on the floor with a smile. With this, he throws himself up while the dragon quickly runs towards him. Basilith crashes into the wall, and Rude, who is flying above him, loudly says that there is a huge difference between him now and his past self. The dragon immediately realizes that he missed him, turns around and watches him fly towards him with his sword in hand. Basilith opens his mouth and is about to release a stream of flames at him. Rude notices this, uses the skill Manipulation of the Rope and thinks that he can dodge this attack with this skill. But if he continues to only dodge attacks, he will not be able to win in the long run. With this skill, he is going to launch himself towards the monster and thinks that in this case, he will use this to accelerate and hit him with all his might. His idea works and Rude flies towards the monster very quickly. Basilith releases a stream of very strong flames from his mouth while he is in the air. Rude puts his sword in front of him and begins to absorb this fire with Graham. He thinks that he can't do anything about the heat, but he can absorb the mana of this attack. If his fire resistance is enough to withstand the fire breath, then he can strengthen the sword with his own mana. He will add the mana that Graham absorbed here and release it all at once. He screams loudly and continues to fly towards the dragon, absorbing the flames with his sword. He closes his eyes and continues to fly towards this huge monster. He is very surprised when he notices that he is surrounded by water and does not take damage from the fire. Alicia uses her magic on him and loudly says that he must continue. Rude swings his sword and loudly thanks her for this. He puts all his mana in the mana absorbed by the sword and deals a very strong blow. With this incredibly strong attack, he was able to cut this huge dragon into 2 parts. Rude lands on the floor with a joyful smile due to his victory. He was unable to stay on his feet and falls along with the dragon that was in front of him. Alicia walks up to him, calling his name and saying that she will heal him now. Rude raises his hand, which is shaking very badly from this fight, to stop her. He sits up and says that she does not need to do this and that she should save her strength. He looks at the dragon's body with a smile and uses the Bloodsucker skill. Because of this skill, all the blood from Basilith's body starts flying towards him. He absorbs it and says that he will heal himself a little himself using the skills from the Hidden Labyrinth. Rude finished using this skill, lays down on his back and says that they should rest for a while. He looks at Alicia and holds out his hand to her with a smile. She does the same with a happy expression on her face. They hold hands and he uses the substitution skill to heal her. They lie on the ground next to each other, and Rude says that they both did well. Alicia agrees with a satisfied look and says that they did a great job. She turns to him and asks, "This is just the beginning, right?" Rude says with a smile that it seems so. He opens his eyes slightly and thinks about the S-rank adventurer. He remembers the man who saved him and thinks that man was much stronger than he is now. He closes his eyes again and says that they still have a long way to go. They go up and Rude says that first he will slice that poisonous monster, and after that they will go further even deeper into the labyrinth. After some time, they came to a large door together and opened it. They see a room with a large glowing ball, a magic circle on the ground, and Rude says that this is the core of the labyrinth. Alicia says with a smile that even among adventurers, few have seen such a view. If they use the magic circle in front of the core, they will be teleported to the entrance of the labyrinth, and then they will get home faster. If he is interested in materials from the labyrinth that cannot be found on the surface, it makes sense to leave the core even if the labyrinth is cleared. Rude says with a serious expression that, however, if they leave this, then one day the poisonous dragon will be reborn again. He looks at the core with a calm face and thinks that he has experienced a lot in the Avilio labyrinth. But thanks to this, he has found the path to his dream. He swings his sword and says that he is grateful for everything to this labyrinth. He strikes and destroys the core of this labyrinth. Sometime later in the Adventurers Guild office, Lockhart asks if there is any news about Rude's team. The girl says sadly that there is no news, they definitely haven't returned yet. He calmly closes his eyes and says that he understands her. He opens his eyes and thinks that he has heard about his nickname of the Unclean Picker. In the world of adventurers, strength decides everything, and his intervention would not have changed anything. The path of an adventurer without strength is very difficult and thorny. He clenches his hand into a fist and thinks that if this breaks his desire for a dream, then this is his path. Suddenly, a guild worker runs into the office with a very surprised face and loudly says that he has an urgent report. This attracts the attention of Lockhart and all the other people in this office. The guy says with a smile that they just returned via a teleportation circle. Rude and Alicia both survived. Clearing the dungeon and destroying the poisonous dragon were successful. Lockhart looks at him with a very surprised face and cannot believe it, and everyone who heard this screams loudly with joy. A smile appears on his face, and he says that he cannot believe it. Who would have known that he of all people would become the savior of this city? He gets up from his chair and says that they should go and meet them. These adventurers are strong enough to change the future. He, along with other people, went out to them and they happily greet them in the corridor. Rude and Alicia look at everyone who came to meet them with happy faces. Sometime later, in the city of Golar, which is neighboring Bologna, the old man looks at the document with the news and with an angry face says that because there are many labyrinths near the city, they destroy new labyrinths indiscriminately. He raises his voice and says that now their plan to intercept powers in the new labyrinths has completely failed. The guy standing in front of him asks, "My lord, maybe this is for the best." Bologna cannot deny their claim to the treasures of the new labyrinths. That is why they destroy them, so that they do not get them. If things go like this, they can demand compensation from their city for the benefits that they did not receive from the new labyrinth due to their fault. The old man thinks about it and says that this is a good way to benefit from the labyrinth without risking their own people. That way they will not lose any more adventurers, right? A sly smile appears on his face and he says that in this case, the Bologna Adventurers Guild may start making claims. The guy with a sly smile says that this is exactly what they are trying to achieve. They will show this old man and his disciples who is the boss of this land. Sometime later, at night in the forest, a bird that was sitting on a branch was frightened by a spirit, who quickly flew up to it. Rude and Alicia are sitting on a log next to a fire on which food is roasting. The system window says that it is a poisonous dragon steak, level unknown, type meat, type rare. She looks at it and says that it smells very tasty. Rude says with a smile that he kept it in his magic bag the whole way and he can finally eat it. Without further ado, he cuts off a piece for himself and eats it. He starts to glow with happiness and says that it is very tasty. So that is what dragons taste like? All the other meat he has tried is not even close to this. It is so sweet and tender that it melts in his mouth. Alicia looks at this large piece of meat with great envy, and he says that the rich taste of the meat is simply incredible. She stands up abruptly and says that she has decided everything. She looks up and decisively says that they should eat a premium steak tonight. Rude is surprised by this and says that he is exactly the kind of steak that he eats. Alicia, looking displeased, loudly says that this is not fair. She wants it too, so they should find a normal restaurant in the area. He needs to finish eating quickly so they can go to the city. 4 days after the collapse of the new Avilio labyrinth, Lockhart is sitting in his office and says that he apologizes for calling them here so often. But they need to finish the report on clearing the labyrinth. Rude and Alicia sit in front of him with a smile and say nothing. Lockhart puts a huge bag of money on the table and says that regarding the reward, 1.5 million Regina are now theirs. Rude is very surprised because of such a large amount, but Alicia remains calm. He stands up abruptly with a very surprised face and asks, "Is this all for them?" Lockhart calmly says that the Avilio labyrinth was rated at level 70, so this is a well-deserved reward. Rude looks at the bag of money with a very happy face, but his attention is drawn to Lockhart's calling his name. He says with a serious look that the two of them cleared the entire labyrinth with just their own efforts. After what happened, he can no longer wear D rank. He must upgrade it as soon as possible. After some time, Rude walks through the hall where there were many adventurers and says that he only recently received D rank. He takes out his card to open the system window with statistics. A system window appears in front of him, which says that he is level 52, race human, status normal. Rude says with a smile that he has improved so much in such a short time. Alicia looks at this and says that although he fought with monsters of a higher level, such a rapid growth is not normal. She thinks that after level 40, it is not so easy to increase the level. Her attention is attracted by the fact that Rude looks at her with a smile and does not say anything. He calls her by name and asks her to show him her level. Alicia was embarrassed by this and loudly asks why he does this. She took out her card, opened the system window, and it says that she is level 45, race elf, status normal. She says that there is nothing interesting in this. Rude agrees and says that it is somehow strange. He has a higher level, but in battle she is much stronger than him. Alicia says with a smile that of course it is so, because a level is just a number. True strength comes with combat experience and skill. The attention of the adventurers is drawn to the fact that an old man from the city of Golar came to them with several people. He looks at someone with a wide smile and asks what they have here. It is that same unclean picker. Rude looks at him with an impassive face and does not answer this in any way. He asks who he is and could he not behave more politely? The old man grinned and asks if the adventurers of Balon do not even remember the lord of the neighboring lands? Rude was surprised by this and thought, did he call himself the lord of the neighboring lands? Wait, this old man is the lord of the city of Golar? The old man with a sly smile says that such ignoramuses cleared the new labyrinth, although this one belonged to him. Rude asks with a serious expression if the Avelia labyrinth is not under their jurisdiction. The old man says with a wide smile that the labyrinth is on the border of these cities, but they decided to take everything for themselves. Not only did they block the passage because something strange was happening there, but they also caused the monsters to leak out and the labyrinth to collapse. All the wealth of the labyrinth that they took and the damage to the surrounding areas. He stops in front of Rude and asks how they intend to compensate for this. Alicia tells this gentleman with a smile that such issues should be resolved between the guild leaders. As far as she knows, the Golar guards did not react in any way to the appearance of monsters on their lands, brushing this task off to the adventurers of Balon City. What questions can he have for them if he himself did nothing? The old man was very indignant because of what she said and could not answer her in any way. Rude looks at her with a smile and thinks that as expected of an S-rank adventurer, she is very knowledgeable about these matters. The guy standing behind the old man says with a sly smile that they met an amazing person. After all, this is Alicia Emerald Wind herself. He heard that she is now working in Balona City. Looking at her current level, it becomes clear why she had to stay in such a place. Rude looks at him and thinks that this man is the Adventurers Guild master of Golar City. The guy approaches them and says that, however, there are no better candidates here. That's why he wants to discuss everything with her now. The old man nods his head in agreement with a smug smile. The guy comes even closer to Alicia and says that he will say it directly. He leans towards her and says that a beaten dog who can only abandon his comrades was not given a word. She immediately turned to him and looks at him with eyes full of surprise. She immediately releases a very strong energy, and this greatly surprised everyone present. The guy looks at her with horror and wonders what kind of abnormal pressure this is. It definitely weakened her to level 45. Lankars came to them and said very loudly that they should stop this right now. From how loudly he said it, a sound wave went out and Alicia immediately stopped releasing her energy. Lankars with a serious face says that he will not allow anyone to start a fight within the walls of his guild. The Lord Guild Master should go after him. The guy with a smile goes to him and says that he should be nice and train his dogs better. Rude with an angry expression looks at him and asks what is wrong with him. Someone comes up to Alicia and calls her mistress to get her attention. The elf with a happy expression looks at her and asks if she remembers him. Rude with a displeased look turns around and asks who is there again. Alicia with a surprised face looks at him and asks, is he Ebert? He with a happy face took her hand and says that he is very glad that she remembers his name. Rude asks if this is someone she knows. Alicia says it was a long time ago. They once cleared a labyrinth with him in their group. Ebert says that he was a fan of the Azure Trail back then. He was especially amazed by her ability to defeat monsters using several spirits and types of magic at the same time. Ever since then, as an elf, he wanted to learn how to do the same. He bows while holding her hand and says that he learned about what happened in the Abyssal Labyrinth and how seriously she was hurt. So he immediately headed to Balon after her. He looks at her with a smile and asks if she would like to join his team. Alicia looks at him with a surprised look and says nothing, and Rude stands next to him and is also silent. She removes her hand and says that she is, of course, pleased to hear this, but she is already on the team. He should let him introduce her partner named Rude. He extends his hand, says his name and greets him. Ebert with a smug smile sharply waved his hand and pushed his hand away. He took Alicia's hand again and said that he had of course heard about the sad consequences of going into the labyrinth of the abyss, and that she had become weak. But for a former S-rank heroine to be on a team with someone like him was nonsense. In his team, her skills and talents would be revealed in all their glory, he promised that. Alicia abruptly waved her hand and broke away, which greatly surprised Ebert. She looked at him with a displeased expression and asked what he was saying. She teamed up with Rude because she wanted to. By insulting him, he had also insulted her. He need not worry about her, because the curse had long been lifted. Ebert, looking surprised, said that it was an SS-rank curse. He was about to ask something, but Alicia turned away from him and said with a smile that she was lucky to have met the one who lifted the curse. He, looking shocked, asked how that was even possible. Alicia winks and thinks that it would be too much trouble to explain everything to him, so they will keep the details silent. Rude looks at her with a smile and thanks her for that. They both leave and she says that her partner will also soon upgrade his rank. He rose from D rank to C. Ebert looks at her with a disappointed face and wonders why did this happen. After all, he tried for her sake. He grits his teeth out of anger and resentment and thinks that he undoubtedly seduced the mistress somehow. A D rank trash would not be able to defeat the poisonous dragon on his own. Unless the mistress really got all her powers back. She was the one who defeated the dragon, and he shamelessly took all the credit for himself. Rude notices that he is looking at him and emitting a very dark aura. He turns around and asks how long will he continue to look at him like that. Alicia sighs and says that elves are quite a proud people. Over time, they completely lost all respect for people. She notices that Rude is looking at her and asks what's wrong with him. He says with a smile that she is also an elf and if you think about it, she should be just as proud. Alicia asks what he is even talking about. She is actually a modest, understanding and well-mannered elf. And also beautiful and strong. After that, they came to the guild worker and she greets them with a smile and says that the guild master has already reported everything to her. She hands him a document and says that such cases are rare at this time. Rude looks at her in confusion and asks what she means. He was very surprised when he saw his face and the inscription rank B on the document. The worker says with a smile that he is one of the few who was able to immediately move to rank B. Rude was very happy about this and says that he cannot believe his eyes. She looks at them, resting her head on her hand and says that conquering the Avelia labyrinth is not an easy task. They also received a report from the adventurers on how they saved the village from the monster. Their contributions in the battle with Baphomet were taken into account. Rude looks at the document in his hands with a smile and says that he has received B rank. His attention was caught by the fact that someone punched him in the shoulder in a friendly manner and says that he deserved it. Rigurd says with a smile that everyone in the city owes their lives to him. Rude looks at them with a happy look and calls out their names. He immediately turned around because Alicia screamed to get his attention. She says with a smile that he shouldn't be too happy about this rank. Or has he already forgotten what they are aiming for? Rude sighs with a smile and says that she is right. He slaps his face with his palms with a happy smile and is about to say something. He happily raises his hand above his head and says that there is still a long way to go to the top, because his goal is to reach rank S. Their attention is drawn to Ebert, who approaches them with a smug smile and asks if he is too stupid to wish for such a thing. The information and dungeons that are available to him depend on his rank. These restrictions were set by the guild for their own safety. What does he think will happen to a person who got rank B at someone else's expense? Or are the people working in Balon's guild idiots who do not see the obvious? With his behavior and what he says, he has set the people around him in a negative mood and they stare at him. Rude looks at him with a surprised face and asks what he means. The guild worker calmly says that she does not know what he has come up with, but the guild has the right to issue ranks at its own discretion. Rigurd approaches him and asks with a displeased look who he called idiots. He and the other adventurers stare at him and ask if he wants to take it back. Ebert smirked and said that it really seems like only idiots work here. Rigurd got really angry about this and grabbed him by his clothes and loudly asked what he just said. Alicia looked worried and said that he should stop. Ebert picked him up very quickly and easily and threw him into the center of the room. Rigurd fell to the ground and screamed loudly in pain. He was very scared because he saw the blade of a sword that was stuck in the floor next to his head. Ebert looked at him with a frightening look and asked how some freak of a man dared to touch him. Alicia called his name loudly and said that he should stop this right now. He picked up his sword and told the lady that she had always been too merciful to them. She even teamed up with a weakling and helps him climb to the top. Alicia said that this was completely wrong. Ebert says that he understands that the elven people are proud and that once she has made a decision, she will not back down. But she is a humble, understanding and well-mannered elf. She should be leading them, being such a noble creature. Rude tries hard to hold back his laughter and thinks that he is too arrogant. Ebert is embarrassed by this and loudly asks how dare he laugh at him. Well, they must see if he is capable enough. He points his sword at him and says to get rank B without anyone's help. They must find out through a duel. The disgruntled worker loudly asks who gave them permission to do such a thing here. Alicia, with a straight face, says that he can try it. He will test Rude's abilities on himself. After that, they came to the guild's training ground in Balona. Alicia apologizes and says that because of her selfishness, he had to get involved in this. Rude, smiling, says that she has nothing to do with it. He just wasn't anything special, that's why it happened. But he just needs to beat him and prove that he's worthy of being on the same team with her, right? He says with a determined smile that in the end, the only way to silence an adventurer is by force.